thank you all for coming. I'd like to welcome you to our AI panel. Just a quick check at the start. Can you hear me at the back? Perfect, thank you. I am particularly excited about this panel and the chance to participate in it, since it gives us a chance to listen to very well qualified people, by which I don't mean me, talking about a hugely complex, fast-moving and impactful area of all of our lives. You will know from your personal lives that AI is starting to influence our music taste, affect our political life, and cause commerce to race towards all kinds of new futures that we have not yet seen. I can assure you also that it's an area of some concern for government. We know from the Office for AI that they're very concerned with 3 areas of development for AI, which they see as a major advantage for the UK. The first being making sure that AI is adopted across the economy. The second being making sure that they support the development of a supply sector which is best in class. And the third, of particular interest to those of us working in universities, is the promotion of a broader talent pipeline to make sure that we have AI talent at all levels ready to fuel the rest of the economy. As one aside, for those of us working inside universities, we are waiting for a further announcement of more master's courses and more funding in mid-October. That announcement does, of course, depend on the fact that there is a person in post to make an announcement, a funding stream to support it. And as I understand it, any kind of certainty that the sun will rise tomorrow. But that aside, it is hugely impressive, and I think credit to Nick and the team, that we have a panel in a world which is dominated by the number of people who are starting to worry about planning for AI in government, in private life, in commerce, in the public sector. It is hugely impressive that Nick and the team have put together a group of people who have overlapping experience to the depth that they have in areas such as commerce, research, and public service. So I think with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Reema Patel, who's head of public engagement at the Ada Lovelace Institute, Sarah Hunter, who's director of global policy at X, which was previously Google X, and Professor Susan Halford, who's director of the established Bristol Digital Futures Institute, newly established Bristol Digital Futures Institute, and I think importantly, a professor of sociology rather than computer science. So welcome to you all. And if you're happy to, Reema, I'd like to ask you to kick off with the first of 3 talks, which will precede a Q&A session at the end. So
brilliant, thank you. So you asked me to say a little bit just before about what AI is, and I think that's a really important question. Let me just wait to see my slide up there, but I'll initially talk a bit about what AI is, or what I think AI is, and the 2 things are actually quite distinct. So the first thing is that artificial intelligence is a hugely contested term, and it's really important to note that. It's contested because of what it communicates, or implicitly communicates. So it's contested because it has the word intelligence in there, so obviously people differ about the extent to which they think that AI has competence or the ability to stimulate or resemble human intelligence. So if it is intelligence that we're talking about, what kind of intelligence are we talking about? For the practical purposes of my presentation, I'm interested in data-driven technologies, which are emerging. So I think that's a really interesting element to it. Often that have particular goals or purposes or objectives, and that are not entirely predetermined by algorithms that allow us to learn from data to achieve particular goals and objectives. So that really makes for quite a narrow definition of artificial intelligence, and some people would actually say that it should be a wider definition, but it's the definition I'm working with, because it obviously this is a policy conversation, and it's really speaking to the sort of slightly more emerging and immediate policy pressures that we're attempting to grapple with and deal with. And I think there's a really interesting dimension to this, which is if you think about the types of questions that we're dealing with around, say, the development of self-driving cars and types of framework we might want to be thinking about when responding to that. You're really looking at the fact that these are data-driven technologies. Obviously, Google, again, it's primary value and business model comes from a lot of the data that is gathered and a lot of the ability that Google and other big tech companies have to gather data and for it to have value and for predictions to emerge or for it to then respond to the needs of consumers in that environment. So it's just wondering whether I might be able to... Oh, right, I've got a clicker here. So the Ada Lovelace Institute, I joined the Nuffield Foundation nearly 2 years ago to be part of the founding team for the Ada Lovelace Institute, and our mission is to ensure that data and artificial intelligence work for people and society. And we were thinking about what we would name this organisation, and as part of doing a bit of preliminary research, I happened upon this, I think, absolutely brilliant quote from Ada Lovelace, which is, "A new, a vast and powerful language is developed for the future use of analysis in which to wield its truth so they may become a more speedy and accurate application for the purpose of mankind." And that last bit, the purpose of mankind, is the bit that I really want to focus on, because when we're talking about AI ethics, I think it's really important to ask who is this for and how do we move away from this kind of technological determinism which suggests that who it is for is just already preconceived, is determined. Actually, there's a really important sense in which we need to be having an active and robust conversation about how technology can work for us rather than us working for the technology. And there's a really important debate in response to recent events, Cambridge Analytica being one of them, but a range of other events illustrating the extent to which too many people do feel quite disempowered and unable to shape the design and the development of these technology. And so I think there's a really important element here, which is that there's an optimistic dimension to this. You know, we do believe that the use and application of data, the extent to which we can understand and analyse data has the potential for huge positive social benefits if realised, and that point is really important. So, for instance, we are working with the NHS to understand the extent to which effective application of data and artificial intelligence can help us target things like eye disease, or to understand how people's lives can be saved, and indeed to measure that. I mean, it's not an easy thing to do, but there's a social value to data as well as an economic value to data. So what's changing here? Quite a lot, actually. I think there's a really important point, which is that, of course, we're looking at the data-driven technology. So what's changing is the sheer scale of data, its volume, and actually the science of data analysis itself. So alongside the amounts that is being gathered, the capacity and our ability to interrogate it and to identify it and to draw out patterns from it is radically changing. The gathering of data, so data-driven technology, seems to be enmeshed actually with the way that we live our lives. To get here, I use Google Maps. I use a range of different tools and techniques. I've taken photographs and uploaded them on Instagram. These are activities that I don't really consciously think about anymore because they're just enmeshed in the way that I live my life. But the key here is that actually that's got huge amounts of value. It's got, of course, economic value. So it's disrupted entire business models, in fact. A friend of mine works for The Guardian and was identifying the extent to which the advertising market share has shrunk for newspapers and broadsheets because of the shift online and the shift to micro-targeting. That's just to give one example. The really key thing, though, is that volume and isn't necessarily better, though. And what's really interesting about this is that volume is, there's a really important question to ask about who has access to this and who can have the skills and the capabilities and the capacity to interrogate and analyse this. And at present, it does seem like that conversation's rather concentrated. So there's a really interesting argument to be made for the opening up and the sharing of that data so that people have access to data, charities, civil society organisations, and are able to make use of it for social value. I think there's also a really interesting ambivalent relationship that we have with data and AI. So what's quite interesting about that is that we have a really positive, in some way, some might say, relationship with data and AI as consumers. We often now hardly think about our interaction with these technologies. They are frictionless, to say the least. That can work for us as consumers. It works for me when I'm rushing to catch a train, or I'm rushing to get to this lecture hall on time, or but it might not work for me if I'm, say, perhaps particularly vulnerable, or having access to low-cost or even high-cost credit at the drop of a hat and the click of a button is not necessarily going to work for me in every single instance. So there's a really interesting distinction between my ability to access these technologies as a consumer and my ability to really benefit from them as a citizen. That's a really interesting social debate that is playing out in quite profound ways. It's really important to note that that's the ambivalent relationship that we have. I was talking about the way we frame the debate about artificial intelligence. Really interesting when you look at the media to see this kind of stories, kind of Terminator-style stories about artificial intelligence. And they really reflect that ambivalence. We do benefit hugely from these technologies, but we also have a really ambivalent relationship with those technologies. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe that's us trying to work out what place they have in the world. And another really interesting tendency, which isn't just about ethics in this technocratic sense, is our tendency to anthropomorphize technology, which, we're thinking about gender, racial issues, intersectionality and equality more broadly, but why is it that until relatively recently, Alexa seems to be female? The range of types of voices that we use through voice recognition tech, the embodiment and the visual embodiment of these technologies seems to reflect existing structural inequalities that exist in our world in quite interesting ways. We seem to, again, I think that's a really interesting reflection of our ambivalent relationship with these technologies. There's sort of a sense that they're in the future, but also a sense that they're part of our fabric of the world, which is quite fascinating. And when we're thinking about ethics, what we're really thinking about is how to take account of the emergence of these technologies and make sense of them in our world, but at the same time respond to the slightly more pressing issues of power, access and control that emerges. So where next? Well, I think there's a really big debate about humans in the loop. So, the title really of this particular discussion is about, you've asked me about the relationship between humans and augmented reality. And I guess my answer is that actually, to some extent, we are already living in that augmented reality. I got here using Google Maps and I didn't think too much about it, and used Instagram and Twitter and all of these technologies that are data-driven. And so there is obviously the rate of change is quite an interesting one. And I use Google search again, and that's pretty driven by AI tools, I'm sure will be discussed shortly. So, I mean, what's kind of an interesting new frontier is that last week we published a new report looking at facial recognition technology and public attitudes to facial recognition technology. And our question really is, like, how far do we want to go with the enmeshing of humans with technology? And the really interesting new frontier is the field of biometrics, of which the conversation about facial recognition technology is only one part. So there is an extent to which facial recognition technology is literally in your face. It is data that isn't even just about you. To some extent, it is you. And it raises all sorts of challenges around privacy, control, access, and concerns about the normalization of surveillance, which is really interesting. At least that's what people reported to us in our survey. But it isn't just the only approach. So, voice recognition technology is a really good example of how you've got these technologies that do actually already begin to gather data about the way we speak, the way we operate, and also gait recognition technology is a really good example. So actually increasingly it is possible to gather information about and predict the behavior of people just by the way, and identify people just by the way they walk, which is really interesting. So I think there's a really interesting question about governance of data and doing the governance of good data well. So a lot of what we're talking about is getting data ethics right, really thinking about who has access to the data, how we can deal with the distribution of that data, how we navigate a really challenging context where it does feel as if the organisations that might be able to benefit from that data are struggling to be able to do so in the most effective way. I'm hoping that's enough food for thought for now, but I'm really keen to hear a bit more from our other panellists about what they think.
Super. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for that. I'm now going to ask Sarah to build on that impressive start. Thank you.
I might stand up actually.
Okay.
And I'll have are my slides up there already? There you go. Okay. Thank you for having me. Oh look, magic. Does that work? Can you hear me from this? Good, okay. So hi, thanks for having me. My name's Sarah Hunter. I'm the Director of Policy at X, formerly Google X. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we do at X, the technologies we're working on, and how I think the way we're doing it and what we're working really are opportunities to augment human enterprise. So first up, who are we? Well, with a bit of Google that is looking at the long-term problems in the world and finding new technologies to solve them. We're not working on the Google stuff, we're not working on problems that Google is solving, we're working on the next problems and the next wave of technology. So some of the things we've worked on, we launched the Google Self-Driving Car Project, now Waymo. That was designed to help solve road safety, human suffering through car accidents. Verily, which is using small sensors to help tackle illness. Loon is using stratospheric balloons to deliver internet to the rural populations of the world. And Wing is a project using drones to deliver stuff and take the resources out of delivery. Now, this is I think we're a pretty unique organization. It's certainly an exciting place to look at the future of technology, but we're not alone. And certainly the last few years, this area of deep tech has really exploded. This is a really interesting report from the startup Genome that was published earlier this year and shows that 45% of the startups globally that were created last year were in deep tech. So by that I mean advanced manufacturing, AI, and you can see down here the things that we think of as the tech sector are actually in decline in this sort of new startup world. So I guess my first point, and this is sort of where Reema started as well, is actually we're not talking about the future here, we're talking about the present. But my second point is really that the machines that we're building at X and that companies like this are building absolutely have the opportunity to augment humans. You know, the machines that we had of the past were robots to extend our muscles, if you like, the physical world. And now we're infusing intelligence via AI into those same machines. We're creating intelligent machines. And so I'll talk to you now about how I think they're there to actually benefit human enterprise in two main ways. Firstly, I think intelligent machines are going to enable us to have better brains. There are many complex questions that right now we're struggling to answer that we just can't answer with our own little animal brains. So climate change. It's a set of many complex, interconnected system problems. And if you look at us as individuals or governments or technologists, we're slightly floundering to know where to put our best efforts. What's the thing that's going to make all the difference? Machine learning and artificial intelligence can help us address some of those challenges and give us insights into where to put that effort. So, for example, food. We're working on a project right now at X, which is in computational agriculture. 30% of greenhouse gas emissions comes from the food system as a whole. And actually, if you look at farming, that's the bit we're working on right now, it's been done in the way that it was done 150 years ago. You know, we do things because it worked in the past, not because it's necessarily the way to do it best in the future. And the amount of resource that we waste in doing so is to the cost of our planet. So machine learning, artificial intelligence can really help, I think, give farmers better information to decide exactly what to grow and how and when, whilst also reducing fertilizer and water resources. AI also enables us to discover answers that we never even thought of. So we've got various projects in the areas of material discovery, drug discovery, where there are insights that can be gained about the best materials or the best drugs for certain situations that humans, through the basic experimentation methods of trial and error, have never come across before. There's also opportunities to use resources better. The building industry, for example, again, massively wasteful. If you can design things through the use of machine learning, you've got a much better set of outcomes. And in general, the explosion in the use of simulation as a tool applied to lots of different new sectors, I think is going to create this explosion in innovation. You can see just there the Waymo simulator. Applying that simulation methodology to areas where experimentation is expensive or very risky, I think will make us come up with new answers that we never even thought possible. But the second field in which I think these intelligent machines are going to help us be better humans is actually in focusing on the repeatable, calculation-dominated tasks. Humans are free to spend our time on doing the things that we are uniquely placed to do best. So arguably, the most empowering aspect, I think, of this new age of intelligent automation is the fact that we're talking about what does it mean to be human in a really meaningful way. Human-to-human relationships, communications can't, by definition, be replaced. Art, creativity, caring, heart-led pursuits, I think, can all be pursued now in a world where actually the intelligent machines start doing the repeatable, frankly, slightly mundane tasks. And I think what we value as a society may well change as a result. So caring is a task that is done largely by women, and 22% of carers live below the poverty line. Will we start to revalue and actually value and economically compensate carers for the first time ever in light of a new world where actually the majority of tasks that are not in that caring field are removed? So I think the machines that we're building have the capability to enhance and augment human experience. And the question is, well, how do we do that? How do we make sure it is an augmentation rather than a reduction? So maybe surprisingly for someone who works in technology, I think the answer is actually in humans. Because the problems that we are facing with AI, the problems that we've just heard about, are not actually problems of tech. Actually, I totally agree with your final slide. It's not a tech problem we're looking at. This is a human social problem. Okay, all the problems that we see that society's been struggling with for generations. Am I paraphrasing you too inaccurately? You can come back to me in a minute.
I'm going to have to keep this for the Q&A.
Yeah, exactly.
There's going to be a fight. We'll do it
Yeah,
later.
exactly. I think the problems that society has been struggling with for generations are actually being embodied in artificial intelligence right now. Privacy, security, racism, control, it's just packaged in a different format. For example, the predictive policing tools that are being used right now in the US are not themselves racist, but the data on which they're based is based on flawed, racially biased practices that police forces have been pursuing for years in communities across the country. So the first task of making sure that AI augments human enterprise is to make sure the data sets are clean and unbiased and not infused with the flaws of humanity. Maybe an unrealistic challenge, but I think that's at the heart of the AI being better than the humans. But the second task is to invest in the people who are building and using AI and try to make sure that the ethics and thoughtfulness is being brought into their practice. So I probably can't play this using this. But anyway, this is a video that we just put up on our website. It's a recruiting video. And it shows roboticists at work. 2 years ago, we wanted to bring ethical training to our engineers at X, and we couldn't. There was nowhere which could provide that sort of training. So we went to Santa Clara University and Omidyar, and together we developed a tech ethics course that is now open sourced, but is also available to all of our engineers. Ultimately, ethics is all about recognizing that there are other perspectives that you need to bring into your practice and not just your own. It's about having the time and the recognition that other wider conversations need to happen. And so actually diversity of teams, I think, is essential to make sure that happens on a daily basis. You shouldn't just be at a later stage referring to an ethics expert. You should be constantly having the sort of conversations with people around the table about how different members of society and different communities might react to the kind of technology you're building. And secondly, I think sandboxing is really important. Maybe test beds is a better term to use outside of the US. Automation products in the real world need testing. You can't just do it in a garage in secret. So actually, you have to have innovators on the ground working with communities to do safely managed experimentation. So we tested our balloons in Peru, we're testing our drones in Australia, and everywhere we go, we are on the ground making sure that we are seeing and engaging with the communities to make sure the products we're building then can be iterated on and made better. And finally, we need the community and political leaders to step up. I think for too long, there has been this divide between technologists and policymakers, and now actually you need to have the policymakers take the role of partners and take the responsibility and power they have more seriously in working with the technologists to make the products better. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you.
Oh, you've already done that. Try not to hide behind the screen. Okay, so my starting point is in some ways similar to the previous one, which is that asking this question, are we moving towards an augmented human experience? We are already in an augmented human experience, and we have been for a very, very long time. We might think about fire tools, wheels, the steam engine, the combustion engine, nuclear fission, radar, or the Turing machine, and we could go on and on. I say this not to be facetious in this context, but to point out in all seriousness that the human enterprise is already, in reality, an augmented enterprise. Now, this said, I understand, of course, that the question is being asked in a particular context here today, and that context is one that refers to the newly resurgent phase of artificial intelligence, which we appear to be at peak AI, as somebody said to me the other day. Artificial intelligence is currently reactivating, artificial intelligence is currently reactivating a whole load of quite familiar discussions about the future of humankind, flipping quite frequently between utopian and dystopian narratives. AI is either going to save us or it's going to ruin us. Most recently articulated in a very public spat between the two tech giants, Mark Zuckerberg on the one side, very much in favour of the positive interpretation, and Elon Musk, of course, building his rocket to colonise Mars, less favourable and less optimistic about the future of AI. The central figure in this discussion about AI is that usually of a superhuman intelligence, the all-knowing, all-controlling artificial intelligence that has some kind of humanoid characteristics, whether it's physically embodied in a human or not, which these days seems to be referred to as good old-fashioned artificial intelligence. It's really clear to be important it's really important to be clear that is not where we are at the moment, as I think both of the previous speakers have mentioned. So although we talk about artificial intelligence in relation to machine learning, which implies something of the humanoid all-knowing, all-being figure that I just mentioned, it's really important to understand that where we are now is really at a very particular kind of artificial intelligence that is driven by what used to be called big data, the very vast quantities of data that are being generated, particularly through digital interactions, the possibility that that allows for the development of computational statistics and the emergence of some really new and interesting methods for doing computational analytics with these new forms of data. Despite some really big claims for the potential of machine learning, at the moment, most of the applications of machine learning are somewhat narrower than those imagined by good old-fashioned artificial intelligence. And in particular, they're dominated, not entirely as we've just seen, but dominated by commercial applications, for example, in recommender systems, in personal assistants, and in chatbots. To date. So far, that is where the majority of these applications are. Now, it's important to say to date, because of course that's the point of this panel, to consider where we might be moving towards, where we might be going in the future. I want to be really clear about this phrase, moving towards, because I find it a slightly difficult phrase. For all the certainty of narratives around artificial intelligence, and we can see some of the tech companies' certainty here about what artificial intelligence is going to do for the world, there is absolutely nothing inevitable either about this movement or about its destination. We are not on some predetermined linear track that technology is going to take us to a certain end point that somehow is already existing, even if we don't know exactly what it is. Now, I say this for two reasons. One reason, because we know that the future of societies, even societies that are forged at the time of profound technical transformation, as in the Industrial Revolution, are not easily predictable. I just show you Marx, Weber and Durkheim as an example of scholars who thought that they understood how modern society would unfold and turned out to be really rather wrong in their assumptions or their arguments and their theories about that. The second reason I say that is to paraphrase the great Donna Haraway and to say that technologies on their own, which has just been said, do nothing. It's the combination of people and technologies that changes worlds. So where does that leave us? I want to suggest that contrary to a kind of fatalistic determinism where we say, those of us who are not technologists say, well, we can't determine the future, we don't know what the future is, so we'll just wait and see what happens. I think that's a huge mistake. I think rather than taking that passive position, we need to say, because we don't know what the future is, we should actively involve ourselves in shaping and creating the futures that we would like to see. And I want to just end with three things about creating and shaping futures and why I think we have an opportunity to do it now. The first one is that I think we are at a privileged moment right now in terms of where we are with the debates and the politics of artificial intelligence. The certainty of those narratives is no longer quite so certain. We are in a moment of wobble, I would say, in a moment of uncertainty. If we think, we can go back to Edward Snowden to some extent and the revelations about the NSA, but also Cambridge Analytica, Brexit, redlining, algorithmic bias, all of these things are no longer operating, if they ever were, in the labs of the artificial intelligence scientists. They have escaped the labs and they are out in the public realm. They have been deeply socialized and politicized. And there is absolutely evidence that not only governments, not only pressure groups and social movements, but also professional societies like the Royal Society of Engineers, and also, actually, yes, industry, are really taking that wobble quite seriously and starting to think about if and how we would do AI for future society. Those very certain narratives start to seem quite fragile, and to quote Stephen Jackson from a different context, that breakage in the stories and orders of modernity, the breakage in the idea that we know where we're going and that we're moving towards somehow a progressively more modern world, offer us a generative opportunity to have a discussion and make interventions about what future societies might look like. What happens next is absolutely key, given that we're in this wobble, that we're at this generative moment. So what does happen next? I think we have to move from ethics towards something that might look more like responsible innovation. Ethics training for AI scientists and roboticists is absolutely critical. and it is a minimalist approach. It is really important to hold scientists accountable for anonymity and privacy and for data security, but it's not enough. It's not enough to say that the future of society will be protected as part of the technical skills of the scientists building AI. We actually need to build the conversation much wider than that, beyond ethical practice, to think about what kind of future society we might want to move towards and what it might take to get there. So to quote Sheila Jasanoff, we need to think in terms of sociotechnical thickness. It's a really horrible phrase, but I can't think of a better one, where we need to understand that the social and the technical are inextricably bound with each other, and we need systematic, in-depth understanding of both in the present before we can begin to think about what that might look like in the future. And that means moving beyond moral philosophy. It means moving beyond questions of right and wrong, moving beyond looking at the individual sovereign who uses data either as a privacy controller or as a data point, to think about society, to think about collective futures and the kind of society that we want to live in. If anything, this is my take-home point. We need to think not only about human futures in the context of rapidly changing technology, but about technology futures in the context of complex, unequal, and highly fragile societies. I want to flip the question as much as you did at the end of your talk. My third and final point is that in order for this to be meaningful, it has to be participatory. How the future is imagined really matters, but my final point is that who imagines the future is an exercise of power. There's far more evidence than I could show you, go through here, but it is absolutely crystal clear that the visions of the future and the capacity to enroll the future has been dominated by wealthy elites and those with other kinds of privilege over the centuries, and that that has deeply shaped the kinds of technologies and the applications of technologies that we end up with. And Meredith Broussard's book is a fantastic history that documents some of that. If you're interested, this second quote comes from Wendy Hall and the AI review. Well, actually, it's not in the AI review, which is a mistake in my view, but it's by the author of the AI review, making some similar kinds of points. In order to do this, and I think changing this is absolutely the hardest part, because it is about power, it is about Zuckerberg and Musk, and it is about the Chinese state, and it is about very powerful actors and agencies. But I think the worst thing we could do is run away from it and be afraid of tackling these questions for that reason. So to begin with, we have to foster the discussion much more widely. We have to think about how the presently disenfranchised and excluded can be part of the conversation about artificial intelligence, and what it would take to really actively generate a project of participation in digital futures. We need to work across all sectors with community groups, with civic groups, with governments, with industry, with NGOs, and we need to have this conversation collectively about where we want to get to, what it would take to get there, and what will happen if we fail. So this is part of my agenda for the future at the new Bristol Digital Futures Institute, which was mentioned right at the beginning. We're working across all disciplines in the university. It's jointly led from sociology and engineering. We hope to work with all other universities in the region and beyond who might be interested in working with us. And we have 27 partners ranging from global tech companies through to local civic organisations. And our aim is not only to talk about how digital technologies are impacting on society. I've banned the use of that word. The aim is to think about how we create technologies for the future in purposeful and creative ways. And I hope that maybe I can talk to some of you more about that, well, maybe in the future. Thank you. Am I on time?
So I'm going to attempt this without microphone. Thank you to each of the speakers, to Reema, to Sarah, to Susan. Thank you very much. I'm not going to attempt this without microphone. I will now throw open to the floor the opportunity to ask questions or make short comments. Would you like to start over there? Do you mind waiting until the microphone reaches you, please? We have.
The microphone carrier.
You are the microphone carrier. That was a very short wait.
So I have a question for Sarah. how do you as a private company decide how the data is cleaned of any potential biases? And also, do you see any role for government regulation in this area, or for participatory methods of determining how the bias should be removed?
It's a good question. Does that work? There we go. It's a great question. We actually aren't working on any projects right now that involve consumer data at all. So this is, my point was more of a generic one about, you know, some of the challenges that we've seen in the use of data by other companies and and I have to say, I do think when you look at this particular topic, I personally, and maybe it's because I'm an employee of a big tech company, I'm personally less concerned about those products because I think there's a lot of scrutiny and a lot of lawyers involved in the products there versus the products that are being built by small companies that are selling them directly to police forces without any of the same level of scrutiny or expertise. But that's just my personal view. We're working on projects actually right now that involve a lot of environmental data. And that's a really interesting question because, like, who owns that data? You know, that data doesn't have faces in, but it's data of, you know, weather, the land, the sea, ownership, sharing, all of those sort of really important questions that, you know, when I was at Google, we struggled with a lot. There's not really many people talking about, and I do think it's a really great opportunity for universities, actually, in particular, to say, look, here's a place where we can start to set some sort of standards of practice here. I think that's a better way to sort of try and get some good behavior and some agreement between tech innovators and sort of the public interest, rather than rushing to a sort of government standard regulation, because I've seen too much of that not work to be the right answer. I'd quite like to try and figure it out with universities and other people who understand data and use it a lot themselves to figure out the answers.
Thank you. Could I throw the question open to the rest of the panel? Thank you for that. Do you have an alternate view of where you see good practice in the addressing of bias, or particularly poor practice in the addressing of bias?
I think there's some really good practice in earlier forms of social science that were not dependent on these kinds of data. I think we could learn a lot from that. I mean, social science itself went through a phase of working with quite, you know, difficult data and not responding to biases in data, but has got much better at that. How you apply that to these, you know, very large scale and often quite confusingly structured data sets where you're not sure what the provenance of the data is and you're not even really sure what's in the data, I think that's a huge challenge, and I'm not sure that there are any really good examples of best practice of that at the moment. Reema may have better.
I mean, it's really interesting, but there have been efforts by tech companies to respond to emerging. I think that it's really important to remember that this is about emerging social challenges. So one, if you're a technologist, you may not necessarily anticipate there would be a problem. That then would be a tech clash, and then a need to react and respond to it. And one interesting example I thought with Google was the search algorithm, where you know, people sort of typed in terms about Holocaust. You know, the Holocaust came up with a list of articles around opinions that were effectively articulating Holocaust denial. And then Google technologists went back and identified what the algorithms were that were generating that, and then rectified it. So I think there's examples where there's that responsive reaction, that there's definitely an acknowledgement that there's a problem and a need to react to that. Part of the challenge, though, is that we're not yet at the stage where the idea of responsive and inclusive design is embedded in a way that is anticipatory. So how do we kind of get to a stage where you don't have that tech clash? And we're actually about to kickstart a program of work just researching that question, because we think there's a gap. So I'd be really interested to have that conversation with you. More broadly, I think there's also really, often bias gets talked about as if it's a technical issue that you can just, and to some extent it is, but actually then there's a much more societal question about what types of bias do we think are problematic. So, because if the issue is differential outcomes from each algorithmic intervention, then that's obviously, that could be seen as problematic, but then there's often differential outcome for different groups of people. And I think there's a really interesting challenge there, which is that as consumers, we like that a lot of things are targeted at us, that are aimed at us, that address, in some instances, our behaviour often fuels the development of technologies that are very personalised, and but often the technologies can then be developed in ways that also embed the bias within its development. So there's a really challenging wider socio-political question, which is that we need to be much clearer about what we're expecting from technology companies around bias. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you. So thank you for the first question. I'm looking out into the audience. Yes, please. Sorry, and I'll come to you afterwards if that's okay.
Thank you. Jelena Lager from the School of Management, University of Bath. My question is to the whole panel, and it has two elements. The conversation today has been primarily from a perspective of people who are living in the fourth industrial revolution, but we cannot deny that there are areas of the world where people are struggling to even have a stable electricity. So my first question is, how do we involve people like that in the conversation of how technology and artificial intelligence should develop? And what is our responsibility in regard to not leave these people further behind than they already are? Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Susan, would you like to start on that?
I think we have a huge responsibility. Is that better? To those people. And I think there has been a tendency to think that we don't need to think about it because they're parts of the world that are not engaged in the digital economy in the way that we are. My argument would be against that would be two things. One thing is that I think pretty much everybody's life in the world is being shaped by digital data, digital technologies of one sort or another, regardless of whether they're using them, if we think about global markets or climate change or whatever. The second thing to say is that if we're thinking about the future and getting, in some sense, this is very difficult for a sociologist to say, but in some sense getting ahead of the future, trying to intervene in the future, then we have to not make the mistakes that dearly beloved Marx, Weber, Durkheim and the theorists of modernity did, which was to think about the world from a very Eurocentric Western point of view. So we have to not do that. How we do it, which was your question, we're struggling to even think about how we do it in a very well understood and familiar context. And I think your question's spot on, and I have no idea what the answer is. I think we have to learn from what we know about participatory methods, what we know about action research. We have to learn from people who already have expertise in those communities, whether they're regardless, maybe nothing to do with technology at all, probably or not. But the worst thing we could possibly do is go stomping in as people who don't know anything about that and say, come and talk to us about digital futures, because that would be ridiculous and insulting, actually. So.
Thank you. Others on the panel?
Yeah, so there's a really interesting set of questions around here. Part of the barriers to enabling participation and engagement in this is, firstly, this is a really rapidly moving space. It is also incredibly technocratic. Or at least on the face of it, seems very technocratic and very difficult initially to articulate to people why they should care. However, I'm a great optimist about it, and my experience with public engagement and participation is that when people have time and they've been given the opportunity to really think about these approaches, they have some fascinating and, incredibly important things to say. So over the last couple of weekends, we've actually been running citizen juries. That's a form of, democratic deliberation on health data sharing with the NHS and with the Office for Life Sciences on some really thorny issues around, data sharing partnership between NHS and commercial providers. And that's been a really fascinating process through which people have come up with some recommendations about what they think good governance and regulation should look like in that space. I think another barrier, however, to democratic participation is very much that it requires organisations who are doing it to share power, and that's challenging in an area which is so, inequities of power are really, really entrenched here. And doing it well means responding to what you've heard. And that's one of the big challenges, is that often those organisations struggle to do that. There are other competing factors at play. However, a huge optimist and supporter of democratic deliberative processes. I think there's other very interesting ways of engaging people. So at municipal level, for instance, Barcelona is doing some really interesting thinking around what data commons might look like. We briefly talked about models of ownership of data, but there's an increasing sort of challenge to the idea that data is something that can be owned. And some people, I think, are looking at the whole kind of Elinor Ostrom model, narrative and way of thinking, where data is actually something that is co-produced, co-generated, commonly shared. So really interesting thinking about different models or different ways of realising the value of data.
Super, thank you. Another question? No, I had a second in the queue, and I will come back, David, in a second, if I may. Please.
Thank you. Jonathan Gibson, a new student here. I've got a question about UK economic policy. AI is one of the sectors that the UK government seems to be getting behind. The sector deal, and it's a grand challenge which lots of local areas will be thinking about. Where do you think the sector will develop geographically, and how do you think it will develop? You know, what will the jobs of the future be like? Where will they be? And do you think the policy and the resource measures go far enough?
Sarah, would you like to have first shot at this?
It's quite a big question, that one. Predicting the impact of government policy is not something enough we're good at. So often we've had lots of different governments come to us at X saying, how do we become the hub of technology, and truthfully the UK is one of them. And I think the thing that we always say to governments is like, what is it you're already good at? Do more of that. Don't be great at AI, because that's been great at electricity. That's just it's a tool, it's just a thing. Don't try and be good at one tool, try and be good at applying it to the thing that you've already got some sort of world leading or some sort of edge in. And truthfully, if it's about AI in general, I'm afraid the US and China are way ahead. Like, let's not try and be good at everything in AI, let's really focus it. I have to, again, and I think healthcare is one of the things that we're really good at, and looking at it from outside the government perspective, but from a commercial perspective, like the NHS data sets are extraordinary in terms, globally extraordinary in terms of you have multiple, everyone uses the NHS for all their lives. So it's a really great set of data. Now, we all know that health data is the most sensitive, possibly the most sensitive type of data. So you have to be really careful about how you use it and make sure that the standards around sharing and retaining and repurpose, all those things are like totally lock solid. And I think the level of public engagement in that conversation is super important. Mm-hmm. But if you can get that right, the payoff is amazing. The payoff for British healthcare users, but also as an IP for then application to other countries is extraordinary as well. So if it was me, that's what I'd pick.
Healthcare as a domain rather than AI as a technology. Thank you.
With machine learning, AI is one of the key tools you use to unlock it. Yeah.
Reema, Susan, would you like to pitch in?
Not really. I think that sounds like a PhD topic to me.
Tell us when you've got the answer. You can write it up.
Just one.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. Yes, NHS data sets are quite a good example of, you've got that longitudinal data, you've got the, it's also a really good example of an instance where there's been quite a lot of tech lash. So, care.data, the attempt to centralise NHS data, even within the NHS, was a very, very hotly contested conversation. So it illustrates the extent to which we need to move very thoughtfully and make sure that it's done in a trustworthy way. I mean, there are other types of data sets which I think are also quite interesting. So, and it kind of does go back to the who has it, So it isn't just the public bodies that have it. So with the NHS, yes, the NHS has access to that. But Mondo, for example, is gathering a huge amount of real-time data about financial transactions that might enable us to predict systemic risk in the financial system. I'm not sure right now whether any of us are able to kind of realise that value, but it does sound, it just does strike me that a lot of data held by large companies that are currently being used to, or could be used to extract commercial value, can also serve social value as well. And I think there does need to be a conversation about how that step is made, so that it isn't just that data is this commodity, but actually we are realising its true social value.
Perfect, thank you. I wanted to ask, because we've been around the subject, do you want a final chance to comment on the answers that you just heard? Great, thank you. Super, this is going to work really well. And I didn't even make a joke about Monzo sharing their data with the world either. Yes, please. Sorry, David, I'll come to you afterwards if that's okay.
Hello, I'm Emma Carmel. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Bath here. I just want to bring something into this panel from this morning's panel. I'm really genuinely surprised. If we're talking about the future, the use of AI, nobody here has said anything about the energy consumption required to motor these systems. Data is not a thing that exists, it's a thing we create. And we use immense amounts of energy, hardware, electricity, heat reduction, and rare earth metals that are profoundly connected to the resource extraction and mining that we heard about this morning. And I'm afraid that there are not technological solutions powered by AI that will resolve climate change that use that much energy. It is not possible.
So your point is that there aren't any technical solutions to climate change?
The solutions to climate change we were hearing this morning, I think quite right, we're talking about complex systems, but insert a highly energy, can you hear me? Yeah. You can't insert into a very complex socio-technological, economic, and political system a technological solution that is itself highly energy consuming and say that's going to help us solve climate change. I don't understand how that's supposed to
I disagree. I think there's lots of applications of artificial intelligence and robotics that can provide us ways to unlock the climate change. I totally agree. It's a very complex set of systems, right? And as I said in my talk, the complexity of the problem is, I think, the major problem. If it was a simple, like, one bullet thing, we'd be doing it. You know, even the most powerful governments or the most powerful tech players look at this and go, I just don't know where to put my effort. And so actually I disagree that you don't have a technological set of solutions that can help unlock that. There's a very interesting paper, which I had in my deck, published recently it was a collaboration between University of Pittsburgh, ETH Zurich, like lots of big universities, about ways machine learning and AI can be applied to the climate problem. And I really recommend reading it because it's not about massive amounts of data crunching per se. It's about, for example, how do you manage the grid? Like, you know, managing the grid, managing peaks and lows of demand. Where do you put in renewables? Where do you turn off peaker plants? That is absolutely a data problem. And DeepMind, for example, did an experiment with looking at the Google data centers and managed to reduce our energy usage by 40%. So there are absolutely ways that the technology can be applied. And frankly, what else have we got? I mean, I'm all for the human-led solution, but I ain't seeing it happening right now.
Thank you. Other
I feel
comments?
quite passionate about
I think we've hit our topic.
There's just a gap in terms of building the evidence base in this space and really understanding the impact. And in part, I think, well, one of the things is that as we're developing strategy on the Ada Lovelace Institute, we are very interested in developing a program that understands the impact of data and AI on the environment. So it's not that, you know, I think the reason that we've not actually said very much about it is there's a bit of a scarcity of research. I mean, much of the research is probably in the academic space. You might have some thoughts about that, particularly if you've been referencing Tim Jackson. But there's kind of a really limited narrative around it. There's one narrative which is, as you say, AI and data is extremely resource intensive and does use up a lot of energy But actually, you know, there is just in general a social cost associated with the development of these technologies. So there's a really interesting set of questions around the global workforce that's involved in cleaning up data, and so it isn't just about the environment, and it is about the place these systems have within our wider planet and our ecosystem, the way that we navigate even international relationships and dynamics of power between nations, which is a really interesting thing. So I think there's a really interesting point around China. But there's another narrative too, and that narrative is exactly the one that Sarah was talking about.
Thank you. Susan, would you like?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is one of the key problems, and it's something that's not been given anything like sufficient attention. I totally agree with you in terms of the energy costs of data and data analytics and the internet and, you know, the whole lot of it. It's really shocking when you look at the energy consumption, and that's before you get onto rare minerals and before you get onto what happens to artifacts at the end of their life and the taking apart of them and the dumping of them and all the rest of it. So I don't suppose anybody here would disagree that there are huge environmental implications, and they are really under-considered, I think. I had a very interesting experience recently. I don't think this is confidential, where I sit on the Programme Advisory Board for the Digital Economy Programme, the UKRI Digital Economy Programme, and we had a bit of a kind of takeover in that board where everybody in the board was just saying we have got to have, this is the number one question for this pot of funding at the moment, is the question of digital and the environment. So I think a lot of people are thinking about it and they're recognising it and they're starting to understand it's absolutely part of our future, and we have to think about the future, you know, in physical, material, environmental ways, as well as in social, physical, material, social, economic and political ways. I really agree with you. I agree that we're not going to find a silver bullet tech fix for it, but I think the arguments that Sarah's saying about how data analytics can be part of the solution as well as part of the problem, and that was absolutely the conclusion we came to in the DE board, was that we needed to think both about how addressing the problems but also really investing smartly in where it could be contributing towards solutions. So I would absolutely walk the line between the two.
Just an aside, Google is the largest purchaser of renewable energy anywhere in the world. We buy more solar and wind than anyone else. And so actually we kick-started the solar market. I mean, like, there are some benefits. You know, it's now cheaper to buy solar and wind as a result of us buying a lot of it. So it's not as black and white as maybe it would be lovely if it was, but it's not.
Thank you. Same offer. Would you like to make a final comment on the subject? Understood. Thank you very much for the question, and for the answers. So I think we probably have time for one or two more questions. Is there anybody else that's itching to ask? Yes, please. And David, you will have the second one. I realise that I'm going to have to pass you in corridors for the rest of the way.
Never going to get a chance.
As the microphone reaches its destination, I apologise publicly to David for continually overlooking it.
Susan Johnson, Senior Lecturer in International Development. I mean, to follow up Emma's kind of cue of connecting issues from this morning to this panel, you know, there's a sort of undercurrent of discussion of ethics and some kind of governance prospect coming from the ideas of participation and the Digital Futures Institute. But the issue of governance seems critical, especially if we're talking about a world that's become more China-centric, and Martin showed us this morning how those tech companies are moving to the top of the innovation and technological league. In this context, how do we even start to think about governance when there are very, very different systems of governance coming from a very different centre of global power? You know, just following a few stories about facial recognition and the inability to escape it. I can't remember the number of, it was millions of facial recognition cameras that were being installed in China recently. And this is being done without a discussion. And I sort of feel, I was slightly itching because I feel like the horse has bolted for this discussion. And reading Shoshana Zuboff, that's all I can conclude in a way, that, you know, we are this is already a socio-technically deep set of relationships we're in. We're addicted to free services. You know, I can't own my own data. I can't opt out of cookies. I tried to do it yesterday in trying to watch The Great Hack, right? How do I get into The Great Hack? It takes, you know, I couldn't even download the Google opt-out from and get it to run. So, you know, irony of ironies, right? So how do we even start? I'd really like to hear what you have to say about me owning my own data, me actually being able to operate in a system that doesn't take it for granted that I want to give my data away, and the governance discussion that's required for that in the context of this huge global shift of power. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting that you're asking that question. It's, I think the really important thing to note is that there are alternatives. I think there's so, you know, there are alternatives to Google. There are search engines out there that aren't Google. There are platforms, I mean, I use some of them. Ecosia is one of them, DuckDuckGo is another.
Even the other search engines feed data into the same data ecosystem.
Yes, no, I recognise that, and to some extent, there's a, you know, yes they do, but they do it on different terms, and
It's not fundamentally different terms. It's still being monetized, it's still being commodified. There's still no way I've locked out of a commodification system.
yeah, other than saying no, you can't, you're not going to use them at all. Yeah. Well, I think what's quite interesting is that there is a plurality of different options out there and emerging, actually. So it isn't just DuckDuckGo, Ecosia, Google, but a range of them. However, I take your general point, which is the extent to which the current system operates is quite disempowering. And I think it goes back to this point about technological determinism. How deterministic do we feel that we are in response to them? I mean, I'm quite optimistic about our ability to react and respond to them. One of the things that you mentioned was China and nationalism and effectively what's being currently described as AI nationalism, and we can't forget that there are quite systemic forces here. So one of the big reasons for, I guess, failing to develop alternatives is it does feel in some instances as if internationally and nationally there is an extent to which nation states are locked into what is effectively an AI arms race, so the desire to innovate as rapidly and as quickly as possible. And the importance of responding to that is to not get, to recognise that that's happening, that is going on, and not get sucked into it. And what's really interesting, actually, is the extent to which ethical leadership is being emphasised, particularly in the UK, on the development of artificial intelligence and the development of data. And you know, there is a really lively conversation. You know, the pickup we got in the last couple of weeks around the facial recognition report we published illustrated the extent to which people are thinking about things like the governance of facial recognition technology, and are very up for a conversation about what that should look like. So we are not, you know, in a situation where we take the sharing of our data for given as a la China. We're able to shape that and move forward with that. And it's a very interesting set of conversations to have. What's really interesting actually about that is the extent to which people have very different views. So it's going to be a really tricky set of things to do, which is to reconcile different perspectives on privacy, surveillance, control, consent, opt-in and opt-out. A lot of people actually, looking at the survey that we conducted, are happy to sacrifice quite a lot of personal privacy for the benefits that they get from their technology. I'm quite interested to see whether through deliberative processes that is affected or changed by increased awareness about access to information, but it would be quite an interesting part of our conversation to find out.
Thank you. Other comments? Would you like to respond to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a lot in your question, so
yeah.
I don't think I can answer all or even know where to start on China and consumer. I mean, it's big. But I agree with you that I feel that the tech industry is much more responsive to consumer reaction and employee reaction than maybe any other industry I've observed or worked within. It may feel like it's sort of, I think one of the problems with the tech industry is that it's so remote. Like, you know, these are West Coast-based companies. You almost don't see a face. If you see a face, it's a face you don't really like, you don't think is real. You know, it's sort of, it feels very disconnected from real people's lives. But actually, compared to, you know, the pharmaceutical industry or the fertilizer industry, it's a much more consumer-responsive industry where debates around, you know, to voluntarily debate, should we even do a technology? Should we be having AI standards before there have been any government standards? I think that's pretty rare, and it is driven by consumer and employee concerns. So I'm much more optimistic that if there is a genuine set of consumer concerns, then actually the tech companies are really well placed to respond to it. But as you say, the tech companies are trying to service global audiences who have massively different attitudes and needs, and that is quite a hard needle to thread.
Thank you. Susan.
Yeah, I mean, it's undeniable at one level what you say, which is that there are deeply embedded power relations, structurally embedded power relations and inequalities in the current socio-technical formation, socio-economic technical formation, if you like. And it is a world in which we've moved beyond nation states, with the exception of some particularly powerful ones, I suppose, to be thinking much more about supranational global tech companies that have bigger incomes than nation states and are more powerful than nation states. And I absolutely agree that that kind of political economy is essential and will continue to be essential. I think it's partly a question of disposition, but it's also a question of theory. So it's how one thinks about, how one theorizes power and how one theorizes social change. And different theorization, as Zuboff is taking a particular set of theoretical positions which lead her to that conclusion that it's all over and we might as well just give up and not do anything. More or less, that's a bit unfair. But she's coming from a particular set of theoretical positions. I'm not sure that at a fundamental level, you know, we haven't had, there's various kinds of revolutions we haven't had in the world. You know, it's not like everything's ever happened in the past, but it's also the case that history is littered with examples of unexpected and surprising outcomes within that broader sort of set of structural constraints, because I think the structural constraints are unlikely to disappear. But I do think that change doesn't happen in that deeply controlled way, and I think change is much more, I think much more in a kind of Foucauldian way about power and change, and that would lead you to a different set of conclusions about where one would look in the global and the local, where one would look in terms of where the pinch points, where the pressure points, where the wobbles, where those things are, that could lead to certain kinds of change. I don't know if that helps. But.
Appreciated, thank you. With apologies for privileging my own ability to continue working in higher education over a really emergent debate. Could I ask David for one final point?
I'm not even your dean.
No.
Maybe talking to them later.
Yes.
I want to ask the question around exactly where you were headed, and that is around surprise. And what we see in terms of, what we see in many cases is that the technologies we create, in a sense, that by and large, they create new futures, with or without us, in a way. Yeah. I think Ruth Miller, in her book Snarl, really kind of laid this out very well. And she talks about, you know, these roads in Paris have been built for the Parisian cavalry to control the city. And then, of course, you know, what happens is that within a few years of these streets, there's riots in Paris, and what they built are these barricades out of the very street itself in order to deflect the, you know, ballista that are coming from the police. And keeping the police at bay, the mounted police at bay in this way. And so therefore, we don't really have, you know, ethics and responsible innovation will take us so far. But eventually, you know, there's something else out there that's surprising, that's non-linear. And all we can, you know, all that we can do from our own, in a sense, from our own social technical positions and our own sense of power, our own places of power, is to understand what those may be. But we have a limited sight, and so it's really that surprise that I'm really interested in.
Thank you. I think I can not catch Nick's eye for a 30-second answer each, and therefore overrun briefly. Nick, is that possible? Thank you. Can I ask for a very brief response? Thank you, David.
Yeah, I have to say that's one of the biggest challenges we have when we look internally within our organisation about how to do innovation in a responsible, lasting way. Is you can only throw out a certain period of time and do your predictions about consequences before acknowledging that actually there are some things you cannot predict. I can't think of a single technology that hasn't been used for good and for ill. Antibiotics, we all loved them until they were given to chickens. There are all kinds of bad applications out there of things that we thought were amazing. And from a technologist perspective, that is really challenging. And it's why I fundamentally believe that the role of other bits of civil society, whether it be governments or NGOs or whatever, I don't really have a sort of like theory of change about what organisation is best. But it can't just, we should all be technologists. That is my thought. It shouldn't just be engineers. We should all be technologists. And we should all be competent enough to understand the technology to be able to engage in these conversations together.
Thank you.
So I think it's about incentives in the system and creating them. So this whole question about responsible research and innovation. The issue is really that, move fast, break things has been the way you gain dominance in the tech industry.
That's not true. That is just not true. That's how some companies have decided, and they have been fallen at their feet as a result. I just don't agree that's the mentality.
Oh, well, I mean, if you look at them, look at the ones that are dominating the market at the moment.
I think Facebook and Uber, sorry, we're getting really specific here.
And
the companies. Oh, no, that's not been the attitude of our company.
You
No.
disagree that Google is dominant in the industry?
Well, A, I don't think we're dominant, but B, I don't think move fast and break things has been the motivating incentives within our company.
But you would say that. But anyway, listen, let me respond to your point.
I certainly have been
Before you
paid
say
to
that.
incentivise.
We were so close to an orderly vote.
You would say that.
2
But
minutes.
Google.
Could I invite all of you to join this ongoing and lively discussion in the coffee break, and ask Susan to just close out for us, if you would.
Yeah, it's the surprise that gives me hope. I agree with you that responsible innovation only takes us so far, but I would rather be contributing to, if you like, in very shorthand terms, the raw materials with which people might be doing surprising things than not be contributing to those.
Super. Thank you, everybody. I would like to conclude, if I may, by thanking the absolutely fantastic panel that we have here, thanking you all for your questions, and Nick and the team for giving us the opportunity to be here. Thank you.